Good morning, sociologists. It is the next lesson in the sequence on research methods you'll be glad to know, and today we're talking about context. I must apologise for the sound quality. I still haven't got hold of my camera and microphone from work. I will have it for the next lesson, don't worry. But in the meantime, we're moving on because the last lesson was all about, geekish things that I quite enjoy. And now we're going to talk about the context. Now, to me, this is relatively new. You guys have been studying it for the best part of a year with Mr. Cuthbert, and therefore you are the experts, and I am merely a guide to show you where to use your expertise, because you already know a lot about this, because the context is edumacation. Learn me a book. And from that, well, straight away, we start entering issues. So let's get straight on. That won't work. Hold on. God, you'd think I'd remember how things work, but apparently I don't. And oh my goodness, I look appalling. I'm sorry that you have to be inflicted with this. No matter. It's soon to be this. Look, the context is education. Unfortunately, my picture is partly in the way of the title. I'll just remove that. There you go. Look, now you can see the title, Context Education. Let us begin, and then I'll fire my fizzog back up. So, as usual, we start with a definition. And in this case, it's literally on the screen. It's important to know where you're doing your research because the methods chosen and the reasons for those methods will differ based on where you're doing your research. I mean, that stands to reason, right? So this will appear in paper 1 in your final examination. Paper 1 of 3 papers. Families and Households is paper 2, which I've been banging on about for ages. So don't worry, this is paper 1. And the context is therefore education. So whenever we learn about a method of research, we are going to apply it because we're sociologists. Although theory is exciting and interesting, theory isn't what, generally speaking, gets us up in the morning and makes us happy about sociology. It's the context and knowing exactly what we're discovering and how. So doing things in the abstract is all well and good, and I will explain them to you, but then you've got to apply them to an educational setting because that's the context we're going to use. Now, you are in an educational setting. Therefore, there's an assumption, I think, on your part and also on mine, that when we mention educational settings and when we talk about the educational context, we tend to be talking about secondary schools. But the point of the context of education is that it goes right the way back to what is officially titled, sorry about the wobble, officially titled early years. So we start in what the Germans would refer to as kindergarten, and so would the Americans, kind of the UK, reception, I guess. And we move right the way through to the end of university. And keeping that in mind, there are several things we need to be aware of. If I can click my buttons. I've culled my image too much on the right-hand side. Can you see that line? It's upsetting me. So, some basics of practicalities when you're talking about researching edumacation. First and foremost, if you're researching student subcultures, for example, which I know you've done work on with Mr. Cuthbert, it is unlikely that your researcher can take advantage of, I don't know, covert observation. Because posing as a student, posing as a pupil is kind of hard unless you look particularly young. And that's before you get to any kind of ethical considerations about dressing up as a young person and being older than a young person. And I know what you're thinking, well, so why not just recruit young people to do your research for you? Well, then they're not researchers, are they? And that will be a different form of research method and comes with its own issues, as I'm sure you're aware. Secondly, if you're researching parents and you want to know about how they operate in schools, then you're going to get a lot of information from school supporting middle-class parents. Of course you are. More on that in a moment. But if you're sending out questionnaires, you are not going to catch the parents that are illiterate. Maybe it's a source of shame. Maybe they simply can't read the questionnaire. But either way, you're not going to get the information you need from those parents. And therefore, you're not going to know how many there are, or what their thoughts are, or what effect it might have. Think back to our aims and hypotheses in the last lesson. So you're going to need to be careful how you do things. Next, you've got that teachers may be unwilling to be honest or open. Now, this may come as a shock, but as a teacher, we've got to think very carefully about what we say about our position, and we've got to be very careful who we talk to and what we reveal. For example, you, if you've been taught by me, know that I regularly talk about me as an example, and that I share certain parts of my private life. And yet, I reckon you would be hard pushed to tell me the names of the 3 children that you know I have, or you would be hard pushed to know anything more than the general location of where I live. You don't know what my house looks like, what type of house I live in, and you don't know about my social media presence, though you know I have one. You know about a beer blog, but you don't know its title, and so on. I'm very careful what I share and what I don't. And a lot of it is curated. So some details are useful to us, and I will use them as examples when talking about families and households, and others aren't, so you don't know them. And it's as simple as that. So when a researcher comes in asking about education and asks teachers about things, well, we might not be willing to be honest. We might be concerned to curate what comes across. And furthermore, there might be other reasons as well. We might work in a situation where the higher echelons of the school are very keen on how the school is seen, and therefore we are coached and expected to do certain things. Consider Ofsted. Do you really think we're honest in front of Ofsted? Would it be in our best interests to be honest in front of Ofsted? What is honesty anyway? How open can we be? And then you've got the fact that schools are pretty strange places anyway. They're enclosed, tightly controlled, tightly regulated. The social rules are very, very different in schools than they are out in the world. The concept of earning respect isn't really something you can do in a school because, well, how is a teacher going to earn respect? Generally speaking, people who talk about earning respect tend to expect it themselves without having earned it, which I find fascinating. But that's within a school. Is that the same in the wider world out there? I'm looking towards the window. I'm not entirely sure that it is. I think it's very different out there. Of course it is. And then you've got the fact that, generally speaking, students themselves are vulnerable. And that's students and young people. We're talking from early years, children aged 2 to 3, right the way through to students entering or leaving university at 21. At any point in that journey, because of the weird situation in education, you are vulnerable. Of course you are. Education requires a lot from those in education, and it requires a lot of positions of authority and power that are open to abuse. As a consequence, any researcher going into that situation needs to be aware of those vulnerabilities and how that actually makes a difference. And that's what we're going to talk about. So this is a unique setting, but it's one of which you have some experience and some of your own views as well. I'm sure you do. Mr. Cuthbert has talked to you extensively about how education works or doesn't work and how it can be viewed in different ways. So you're aware that there are different interpretations, and I'm sure you have your own interpretation, whether or not you agree with any of the ones that we put forward as teachers. So, when it comes to education, there are 5 main areas of research that I'm going to cover, and I have color-coded them for your convenience. Now, I won't get through them all this lesson. I'm going to get through, I think, the first 2 in this lesson. We'll see how we go. I'll amend the slides so you only get the bit that's relevant, and then you'll get the whole thing when I've done the whole thing. So, we'll start with pupils, and we start with a researcher called Malcolm Hill, who in 2005 argued there were 3 things that you need to be aware of when researching pupils. You need to be aware of power and status within the school setting and within society. You need to be aware of their ability and understanding, both academic and in terms of more nuanced emotional understanding. And you need to be aware of their vulnerability and thus the law when it comes to dealing with students. If you're going to go and research students, you need to be aware what you're doing. Now, I have researched students. All teachers who took a PGCE had to. It's part of our course. We have to go and write essays on students and how they respond to things. And that carried with it a group of ethical considerations. And until I started teaching sociology, I didn't realize that was actually sociology, but it was. I quite enjoyed it, actually. You'd think I'd have noticed it would be sociology before now, but apparently not. The next group are teachers themselves, and hey, I am one. And there is power and status involved in that. And I am keenly aware of it. Were this a usual year, and where I be teaching it, yeah, no, I can't do that. Had you been in A5, basically, in a normal year, and some of you might have been further down the school, you will have noticed that I plastered it with quotes all around the room in blue and pink. The pink ones were designed to give you ideas about words and terms used in history and politics and also sociology. And the blue ones were just basic quotes about life and history and how it worked. Now, some of you may have had me in year 9. I can't remember offhand if any of you have. I'm sorry if that was the case. But you may remember at the back of the room, I had a series of quotes that were designed for me, including Alan Moore, people should not be afraid of their governments, rather governments should be afraid of their people. And also Lord Acton, who said, all power tends towards corruption, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they are there to remind me of the situation played by teachers. As a teacher myself, I need to be reminded, otherwise you can go on an ego trip, because yeah, we are an authority. We do have power, we do have status, and we've got to be careful about that when interviewing teachers or researching teachers. Secondly, teachers are all about impression management. He says, with the most unkempt beard you've probably ever seen, and well, this hairstyle. But I do, believe it or not, manage my image and my impressions. So even this video, you can see that I'm doing it in a white void. You can see that I'm wearing a jacket. You can see that I'm wearing my school ID, and yet I'm not in school. I'm not even with a high definition camera. Interesting. Almost like I designed this look. Then you've got the classrooms themselves. Classrooms are unique places. The situation of a classroom is that it is enclosed, it is controlled, it is small, it is at maximum maybe 40 people in that space. And those relationships are defined very much by a whole host of things. And if you want to drill down deep, just the setup of the room can change how you interact. Consider COVID secure education versus normal education, U-shaped desks versus rows and columns, group tables versus not. The shape of the table, most in school, in fact, all of them, I think, are rectangular in shape, but at primary school, they might not be. They could have been hexagonal or half hexagonals. And that's itself very interesting. Also, there are gatekeepers. People allow you in or out of that classroom, and the number of people you've got to go through in order to research that classroom environment. And they're going to be able to, at every point, frustrate your aim. And there are also peer groups. Within every single classroom, there are groups of peers who work in different ways, and everybody understands that. In the Ecclesbourne context, you guys worked in forms until year 9, and therefore your forms developed calcified and stratified peer groups in a way that I am simply not used to. And they would be different in maths and science, where you were jumbled up by ability and set. And those peer groups will be different again to English because of the subject difference, even though the setting might be similar. And those peer groups will change again in GCSE, and they'll change again in A-level. And every single classroom has its own set of peer groups and ideas and relationships between those peer groups, what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, who's the joker, what jokes are accepted, what jokes are not. And you've got to be aware of that as a researcher. Schools themselves are a unique setting. They're very strange. They take society, they boil it down, they take a bunch of rules, and then they calcify, and every individual school is different. And I've been through this. Ecclesbourne is weird. I am an outsider. And those of you that come from other schools into the sixth form will have noticed that Ecclesbourne has situations and ideas and approaches that are just so completely weird. My favorite, of course, as you're well aware, is that whole issue revolving around skirts. Every female student feels they have to wear them. They'll get laughed at otherwise. And have you seen the trousers that are in the uniform? But every schoolgirl at Ecclesbourne also attempts to break the rules on how to wear those skirts. I have never known anything like it. Any attempt to break that stranglehold of the school skirt is laughed at and bullied, and yet everybody seems to hate them. And the excuses used to say why they don't are weird, but it's a cultural thing at Ecclesbourne. It is not shared in any other school I've worked in. I say that like I've worked in a lot. I've only worked in 5, but you get the idea. Every school has its own unique aspects, and a researcher, therefore, can't obviously research all schools, but has to be aware that the school they're researching may be unique in ways they're not aware of. There's also the school's own data. Schools are a data-rich environment. We have to keep records on literally everything, from registration to academic performance to anything that's reported. We have to write up student conversations about disclosures or non-disclosures, bullying, complaints. Can you imagine how much data we have? I mean, I'm not exactly a data monkey, but you know I love data charts and stuff, and all of my databases are color coded. I like that, but not everyone's are. And then there's a repetition of data. Ofsted want data, the DFE want data, various local stakeholders want data. We have incredible amounts. So a researcher could theoretically use the school's own data, but then why is the school keeping the data? To what end? To what aim? For example, in Ecclesbourne, how are absences recorded? These are different to how I've seen them recorded in other schools. There are two absence marks that can be used for people who later turn up in the day, L and U. U means long-term lateness, i.e. missing a lesson in other educational constructs. In Ecclesbourne, L is exclusively used. In another school I went to, any lateness was marked down as U, and L was never used. There was no point for it. So it depends what that data is designed to do in terms of how you can use it. And that's just attendance data. Don't get me started on anything else. There's the law, obviously, plays a role in getting into schools and getting out of schools. There's the gatekeepers, the number of people you have to get through in a school to get the information you want. And every single one of them have their own agenda that you then have to navigate as a researcher. And there's also the weird organisation of schools. Every school organises slightly differently. Ecclesbourne has no bells. Other schools I've worked in had movement bells. So between each lesson, there were two bells, one to announce the end of the previous lesson and one to announce the start of the next. And in the meantime, you're meant to move to that new classroom and line up quietly outside of it. And guess what? It worked. But lining up in Ecclesbourne, I've yet to see work intuitively. There's an incredible amount of time and effort that I spent trying to get people simply to line up quietly. It's an oddity. And then there are parents, the final group. Engagement and suspicion. Sometimes parents will be equally engaged, but they are school lovers and they are generally middle class and they will be happily taking part in any research opportunity. But maybe you want to learn about school refusers or people who don't like school and feel it's an imposition, or people who complain about school. And they're going to be much more suspicious of any researcher coming through a school context because they're coming through a school context or they're asking about school. And therefore finding out the views of those parents is going to be really hard. And you've got to bear in mind that the information you do get back from parents tends to be from people who like school. And finally, there's access to parents. Getting access to those parents is hard. Schools don't just randomly hand over data on their parents. We have a duty to maintain privacy on that data. So finding out who the parents are and where they live can be quite a trial. And that's before we even get to things like split up parents or parents who are undergoing messy divorces, who have undergone a messy divorce, who are arguing and trying to work out who gets to look after the children and who gets informed about what, and they don't want the other parent knowing X, Y, or Z. That's before you even get to that messy sort of stage. That's just on the basis, the basics rather, sorry, not the basis. And they all play a role. So each group has its own unique challenges and advantages, and we'll talk about those. And the final thing you need to be aware of is that literally everyone has been to school. Any researcher researching school has their own experience of school that will play a role. Me as an educator, as a teacher and a researcher, I guess, I have my own experience of school, and I would bet my bottom dollar that it's pretty much very different to anything you've experienced. Why? Because I'm well aware how odd I was at school, but also because, well, my school was different to yours. It was a different era, it was a different time, it was a different place. So my technology lessons are totally different to what you're used to. My experience of sixth form is so alien to yours. We didn't have a uniform at my sixth form, and that was normal. We didn't have blazers further down the school. We didn't have many clubs as you understand them. The concept of playing Actually playing in a secondary school context was so alien that you got bullied for it in year 7. The whole point was you wandered around and stood about having a chat. The concept of playing a game that wasn't football, and even then not organized football, we didn't have pens, was just alien, utterly alien. No one did it. At primary school, we did have play, but again, it was really weird and different, and the context was so strange. And then you go to schools in your area and so on and so forth. Basically, the importance is that researchers have their own unique individual experience of school, and that will color what they think, it will color what they research, and it will color how they research and how they choose to do that research. So there's the basics, the context, if you will. I'm now going to move on. We're going to talk about researching pupils first, the unique issues that you have when researching pupils, and how you apply the pet. In this case, I guess, a dog or a hamster. Hamsters are cute. We'll go with hamsters. Pet, that is the practicality, the ethics, and the theoretical considerations. And I said there were 3 areas that we needed to look at. So those are the areas that I'm going to proceed and look at. So let's start with the power and status of young people. Adults, generally speaking, have more power and status in society than children and young people. And that just goes without saying, I guess. This makes it difficult in wider society for children and young people in particular to put forward their points of view, at least openly. They've always got to consider how adults will respond. And that goes right down to the youngest of children. From the very beginning with your parents, you learn to check your parents about what you're expressing. Because, as we've discussed in families and households, children are controlled by their parents. And we know this. Even the most open and encouraging of parents will inadvertently and perhaps even deliberately control what their children do based on what they think is best for their child. Children learn quickly that they cannot share their opinions openly. They've got to modulate what they say and how they say it. Consider how many parents have told off children for whining. Consider in school how much that is magnified. So it's hard to for students to state their attitudes and views, especially if they challenge those of the adults around them. Furthermore, it gets even worse in school because schools are hierarchical institutions. Schools will enforce things like even asking to go to the toilet, for example. A fun one of mine that I do find an interesting one. Do we enforce it or don't we? What exactly are the rules and how are we supposed to enforce them? Are we supposed to enforce them? Are they just there as a guideline that you don't feel you can cross? Are they essentially a chimera about classroom control? And your views on that have to be carefully modulated in a school setting, more so than out there in the world, because you don't know who the researcher is, what they're about, and whether or not you can trust them not to pass it back to the school staff. Why are they asking you these questions? You see what I mean? Teachers can use this power to influence which students are selected for research, both openly, don't talk to that student, you must talk to this student, and also on a more manipulative level, where you just sort of nudge people. And trust me, I know about nudging. I'm pretty good at it. More on that later when we're talking about teachers. And that might be to promote a good image of the teacher themselves or of the school, or conversely, it might be designed to promote a bad image of the school because the teacher has a grievance. Or it might be a particular view the teacher holds about students. You've talked about labeling theory, for example. And that's fascinating too. And you've got to be aware of that as a researcher. So there are formal power differences between pupils and students and the staff at a school. We have more powers than you do. We can go more places than you can, obviously, for obvious reasons. And that means that any kind of formal research method will enforce that formal power differential. So if you're going to go in and do structured interviews or questionnaires or any of that sort of thing, it will determine how students will respond and how they will see that. And they may respond in a way that is in keeping with the school situation, rather than being honest and open or giving you the answers that you're looking for, if you see what I mean, whether or not you're looking for a particular response, but a particular type of response. So researchers have to be aware of that. It's the researcher that works out the questions, not the students, unless you're doing unstructured interviews, and then, well, that runs into problems elsewhere. One way around it is to Try group interviews rather than one-on-one. Group interviews allow students to bounce off one another. They're more likely to be honest and open. So, for example, when I was interviewed as a teacher, I guess that makes me a researcher on some level. One thing I've noticed is when you have a student panel, if the teacher is less involved, the student panel tend to get more honest. And the longer you're there, the more honest they get. This is especially true if multiple interviewees are in the same room as those students, and students will take a shine to you. And I found one of the most effective methods of getting on side, because I am a naturally curious person, was basically to ask them about their thoughts and then just sit and listen. They tend to stop interviewing and they tend to start being interviewed. And I found that a wonderful insight to schools. In one case, at one school where I was doing an interview, it was really helpful, but I ruined the process and I got complained at afterwards. I was told off by my person giving my feedback for the interview. In no uncertain terms, they told me that I should never apply there again, and how very dare I? I ruined their student panel. I was like, oh, I'm sorry, how? Well, it turned out half the panel threatened that if I wasn't employed, they would never do anything for the school again. And the other half said anyone but him. I ruined it. I ruined their student panel, and the student panel they'd used it for countless interviews, same students, they could never use those students again. Brilliant, I guess. I don't know. I don't know why that was my fault. Interesting, I'm Marmite. But you get the idea that group interviews can lead students to be more honest. But there's also peers and relationship with the teachers. So relationships affect responses. Students who hate authority are much less likely to cooperate with a researcher and with research generally, because they hate authority and they don't like school. And maybe you want to learn about why they hate authority and why they don't like school. And that's going to be a difficult barrier. But once you reach them, they're more likely to be honest than someone who really loves the school and is perpetually trying to find a way to put that forward as a positive and something that the researcher will like, trying to find right answerism, if you will. I'm aware I said I'd go further than this, but I'm also aware that I've spent a good, oh my goodness, almost, a fair amount of time. So I will do one more and then I will hold. So I probably won't get as far as teachers today. That might have to wait for another lesson, but that's okay. We'll see how we go. The next thing I need to talk about is ability and understanding of the students themselves. So generally speaking, young people and pupils generally are more limited than adults in their ability to express ideas and to understand what it is they're trying to communicate. Now, that doesn't mean they can't have those ideas. It doesn't mean they can't understand on some intuitive level complicated relationships and understand their place within them. Rather, it means it's difficult for them to understand what it is they're experiencing. Take yourselves, for example, and you've been taught about education. How easy have you found it to apply what you have learned to your own experience of school? How easy have you found it to challenge your own experience of school? Think about families and households. I do a lot of challenging stuff. I make a point of making my students, you, feel a little uncomfortable because I want you to understand that all families are different. And think how challenging that has been. You have experience of family and you're being told from the front that that might not be how all families work. You kind of knew that on an academic level, but being faced with the actuality of it is really hard and challenging. Learning that your views of a particular point of view aren't necessarily the views and simply one of many is challenging, especially as a teenager where you're just learning how to express your own opinions. Think about how much more difficult that sort of process would be when you were younger. Can you remember? Well, it is a thing. Abstractions and abstract concepts like class or well-being or understanding itself are difficult for young people in general to talk about. Adults struggle with it. One of the things I find from my perspective is just how difficult human beings find communication. No one can agree on a definition of a word or how a word is supposed to be used. And as a consequence, people struggle. Thus, gaining informed consent from students is virtually impossible because you've got to explain the research and then you've got to make that research work. And then you've got to make sure that they understand that research. Good luck with that one if you're researching 2 to 3-year-olds. Slang, language, and formality also play a role. And now I really am running out of time to make this lesson work, and I think I've tarried long enough with the presentation of it. So for now, this lesson will end. I'll come back to this later in the week in the next lesson. So yeah, looks like I over-prepared for a change. Yay! Have a lovely day, Year 12 sociologists. Think about the education you're undertaking and think about the weird context that it is now. Maybe that can form an example in a future essay. Thank you all very much. Have a lovely day, and I shall see you in the next video. Stay safe out there.